Hi, my name is Carolyn Parkinson. I'm an assistant professor at UCLA, and in this video, I'm going to be speaking about using neural responses to naturalistic stimuli to predict social outcomes and to predict individual differences more generally. So I'm going to start by giving some broader context on naturalistic neuroimaging to set things up, and then I'll go into an example of using naturalistic neuroimaging to predict things like who will become friends with one another and people's real-world social network data. And then I'll zoom out a little to discuss issues that you might want to consider if you're thinking of getting into this kind of work and designing a naturalistic neuroimaging study for the first time, including choices you'll make when designing your study and when analyzing your data, and also things to keep in mind when interpreting your results. And so I think it's useful to start with a little bit of background that the work and ideas that I'll be focusing on are really rooted in. So as you likely know, pioneering naturalistic neuroimaging work by Uri Hassan and colleagues found that naturalistic stimuli, like, for example, movie clips, evoked more reliable responses within and across people than just laying in the dark or looking at artificial, more stripped down stimuli. And within the category of dynamic naturalistic stimuli, expertly directed films elicited more reliable responses across people than, say, unedited video footage of typical happenings in a city park, which incidentally you might consider more truly naturalistic than a movie, and I'll get back to that and other issues to consider with respect to stimulus selection in a little bit. But what this suggests is that things like movies, particularly deliberately engaging ones, despite being relatively uncontrolled stimuli, really effectively control neural responses. So they make our brains tick together, so to speak, to borrow the words of these authors. And on that note, I really want to emphasize that it's extremely important to consider the effects of stimulus choice here. And in all the studies that I'll be discussing, particularly if you're thinking of designing your own naturalistic neuroimaging study for the first time, because when we discuss findings in general terms, we often don't explicitly consider the specifics of the stimuli from the studies that we're talking about. We just generally speak of people watching videos or hearing stories in the scanner in sort of generic terms. But the choice of stimuli here is really important depending on the goals of your study, and it's something that I'll be returning to over and over again throughout this talk. So I think it's really helpful to recognize how thoughtful researchers have been in selecting and sometimes even creating stimuli for their naturalistic neuroimaging studies and considering that when designing your own research studies. So in some of the foundational work establishing that things like movies produce significant synchrony across people's brains, these investigators were really thoughtful and inventive in using really expertly directed classic films like Hitchcock films. And these are not only engaging narratives that unfold over time and that are rich with meaning, they're also really effective at constraining and driving people's attention and their interpretations and their expectations as they watch the stimulus, because film directors are really in the business of shaping how we deploy our attention, how we emotionally react to things, and what we expect to happen next. And so these kinds of stimuli are really exceptionally well suited to entraining people's information processing across individuals. However, the extent to which you're entrained with others can vary depending on the features of the surrounding context, as you'll see in Yara's great talk in this course. So if you manipulate people's priors or their goals, even in relatively subtle ways, like what you see on this slide here, this can really powerfully shape how they process the same naturalistic stimulus. And looking at where these effects are instantiated in the brain can inform hypotheses about what kinds of mental processes are being impacted by these contextual manipulations. And so this opens up a lot of interesting possibilities for people interested in social questions, since social neuroscience and psychology are inherently interested in how social context shapes how people think, feel, and behave. And there's also a sort of intrinsic context that people bring to the table themselves when processing the world around them. So we all walk around in the world with our own unique preferences and frames of reference and existing knowledge structures that we integrate new information into, past experiences, personality traits, and so on. So we all have these filters through which we see the world. And naturalistic neuroimaging is also a really powerful tool to get at how these aspects of individuals also shape how people process the world around them. So not just context, also these individual differences. For example, in children, neural synchrony with adults in the IPS and in Broca's area when watching Sesame Street reflects levels of understanding of numerical and verbal content. And as you see here, adults with differing levels of social paranoia show distinctive responses in parietal regions involved in belief processing when listening to an ambiguous social story. And you'll see this in more detail in Emily Finn's really excellent tutorial in this course using some of these data. And again, the choice of stimulus is really intentional here, is likely really important to promoting sensitivity to these kinds of effects. So for example, in this social paranoia study, they constructed a narrative themselves that was specifically written so that some people might find it suspicious and others might not. So the key takeaway here for our purposes is that interpersonal variability in neural responses to the same stimulus in the same situational context isn't just noise. It reflects, at least in part, meaningful variability between people in how realistic stimuli are being processed by the brain. And this is really exciting for people interested in social phenomena because this means that naturalistic neuroimaging can provide a way to examine how the ways in which people process the world around them are shaped by the features of the situations that they find themselves in, and by things like their preferences, their expectations, past experiences, traits, and so on. So in the next part of my talk, I'm going to be going through examples of work where we examined how endogenous individual differences in neural responses to naturalistic stimuli predict social outcomes, like who befriends whom and where people sit in their real-world social networks. So in this study, we wanted to see if similarities among friends extend beyond just demographic characteristics, so surface level things, to how people see the world around them and how they process their environment. Sort of in line with the old adage that birds of a feather flock together. So until recently, a lot of the evidence for the tendency for people to surround themselves with similar others, also called homophily, has really been focused on relatively coarse variables like demographics, despite the perception reflected in that saying, birds of a feather flock together, and in a lot of our intuitions, that friends are people who we sort of click with, who respond to things like we do and see the world from a similar perspective to our own. Here we want to test this notion. And of course, one window into how we respond to the world, so into our thoughts, our emotions, how we allocate our attention, and so on, as these things unfold over time, is of course provided by neural response time series. So if we are exceptionally similar to our friends in how we attend to interpret and respond to the world around us, we'd expect our neural responses to really engaging, dynamic, real-world stimuli, like, for example, movie clips, to be exceptionally similar among friends. And we can glean some insights into what kinds of mental processing might be particularly similar among friends through the localization of results. So here we characterize the social network of an academic cohort by asking everyone in this professional school cohort who their friends were, essentially. So here the circles are friends, lines are mutually reported friendships between them. And this sort of hairball-looking graph of the network doesn't really tell you all that much about the structure of the network, obviously, especially when it's drawn this way, showing all the nodes and all the edges. But this is really just supposed to illustrate the procedural logic of the study, where we characterize all the social connections between all these different students in this program, and then had a subset of them, the people you see signified in peach here, come in for an fMRI study where they just watched a series of videos while we scanned them. And so we had a few criteria for choosing these videos. We wanted things that participants likely hadn't seen before to avoid similarities among friends being inflated simply because they'd seen more of the same things before, heightening their familiarity with those things, maybe changing how much attention they pay to them. We also wanted things that would be engaging so that they would hopefully recruit a good proportion of the suite of cognitive and emotional processes that characterize our everyday mental life, and minimize mind wandering, which would of course be a source of noise here. And so this minimizes variability between people due to thoughts that are just completely unrelated to the experiment. But we didn't want to squelch inter-subject variability completely here. We also wanted videos that would introduce some meaningful variability, because different people might interpret them differently or attend to different aspects of them or have different emotional responses to them. So we wanted videos that minimized uninformative inter-subject variability by being engaging, but that would promote more meaningful inter-subject variability And this prompted us to choose things, for example, that some people might find sweet, touching, and adorable. Others might find kind of sappy, cloying, or overly sentimental. Things that some people might find really funny, so that might appeal to people with a certain sense of humor, but not others who might fail to appreciate or maybe even detect the humor in these clips. And so we had some examples of pretty sophomoric, lowbrow humor, also some slapstick, kind of physical comedy, and some more wry, cringe-based comedy. And we also use things that might be understood or parsed differently depending on people's knowledge and interests, and arguments as well that people might resonate with in some cases, but that might evoke skepticism or even contempt in other cases. And while participants watched the videos, we measured how activity across the brain rose and fell over time. And so on top you see data from throughout the brain from 2 participants, and on the bottom is this activity summarized in superior temporal cortex for these same 2 participants. And it's been sped up a bit, as you can probably tell, for the purposes just of this visualization to give you a sense of the data without having to linger too long on this slide. But you can see that these 2 people look relatively in sync with one another, especially at some points in the video. And they also happen to be friends with one another in this case. And so we wanted to test if, in general, people who are friends and people who are closer together in their real-world social network would have more similar neural responses when they're viewing these naturalistic stimuli. And so to get at this, for each pair of fMRI participants, we parcellated their brains into constituent regions based on anatomy using FreeSurfer. And so different regions are shown here in different colors. And then we measured the similarity of their neural response time series in corresponding brain regions as they watched the videos. And then we can go back to that social network data that I told you about earlier, see how close together each unique pair of people is in the social network. And then we can relate that social network data, so the social network proximity between a given pair of people, to their neural response similarity. So for each pair of participants, we have an 80-element vector here, capturing the similarity of their neural response time series across 80 anatomically defined brain regions. We can go back to that social network data, see if they were friends, so characterized by social distance of 1, friends of friends, so social distance of 2, or farther apart in the social network, and we can label them accordingly. And so first we wanted to see if we could discern how close together people were in the social network based on their patterns of neural response similarities. So on a subset of this data, we trained a machine learning algorithm to distinguish friends, friends of friends, and so on based on patterns of neural similarity. And then we tested if we could give this model brain data from a new pair of people who it had never seen before and tell us how far apart those people were from one another in the social network. And so of course, if there weren't any information about social distance in the neural response similarities, we'd expect a confusion matrix that looks something like this, with each distance category being classified as every other one about a quarter of the time. So about a 25% accuracy rate. We downsampled the data, so this would be what chance would look like. And while this is what we get when we randomly shuffle the data labels and do this analysis many, many times, as shown in this histogram, in the actual data, we see considerably higher accuracies along the diagonal with an overall accuracy rate in the 40s. So that's shown here by this red dashed line. So by no means perfect, but significantly greater than 25%, the chance rate. And so we can predict the social distance between 2 people based on their neural response similarity at a rate well above what you'd expect based on chance alone. And I should note, just as an aside here, that in all these analyses, we controlled for all the demographic variables that we could get our hands on, things like age, gender, ethnicity, and nationality. You can see here we have these 4 social distance categories, but in the interest of simplicity and time for the next few slides, just wrapping up this example study, I'm just going to focus on these distance 1 to 3 dyads. So you might be thinking, okay, well, you can classify social distance from neural response similarity, but is it the case that friends and people closer together in the network are actually more similar to one another? It doesn't have to be the case based on those results. So we can go back to these vectors that I showed you that we have for each dyad and group them by social distance, and then project those onto the brain just to see this relationship more clearly. And so here on this image I'm going to show you, warmer colors will mean more similar than average for a given brain region. Cooler colors will mean less similar than average for a given brain region. And first, let's look at distance 3 dyads. So for people 3 degrees of separation from one another in this social network, we're seeing cooler colors in many regions, suggesting that these people are responding pretty dissimilarly to one another. The opposite seems to be true overall for distance 2 dyads. So here we're seeing some warmer colors, suggesting these people who aren't friends with one another, but are friends with one another's friends, are responding to the videos more similarly than pairs of people farther apart from each other in the network. And then if we look within friends, we see warmer colors, indicating that these people are responding to what they're seeing in an exceptionally similar way. And this pattern is exceptionally pronounced in regions that determine things like how we allocate our attention, like the superior parietal lobule circled here, where friends are exceptionally similar, and then the similarity decreases with social distance. So to return to the question that prompted this study, do we see the world like our friends do? The results of this study suggest that yes, there does seem to be this interaction between how our brains process the world around us and how our social networks are organized, such that we tend to be surrounded by people who process the world similarly to how we ourselves do. So now going forward, we're doing subsequent work looking at questions like, do we befriend people who are already like us and how they respond to and presumably see the world? Do we grow more similar to and kind of align ourselves with our friends over time? And in what ways? We're using longitudinal naturalistic neuroimaging paradigms to tease these possibilities apart. And we're also working with additional fMRI and behavioral paradigms to really clarify what kinds of processing of what kinds of stimuli might be driving these effects using hypotheses informed from this naturalistic neuroimaging data. So this is one example of how naturalistic neuroimaging can be used to predict social outcomes. So I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes kind of taking a step back and going over some practical considerations that will hopefully be helpful if you're thinking of running a naturalistic neuroimaging study, particularly if you're interested in predicting social outcomes or individual difference variables more broadly speaking. So I'm going to start with some design considerations, so things to consider before you even start running your study. So the first thing is stimulus selection, as I've alluded to a few times now throughout this talk. So one of the nice things about naturalistic paradigms, generally speaking, both for researchers and for our participants, is that they're generally pretty fun and interesting, especially compared to more traditional neuroimaging tasks where people might just be laying down for an hour or so, looking at static images interspersed with fixation crosses, trying not to disappoint us by falling asleep. And as you saw at the start of this talk, things like really engaging, professionally directed films are really excellent at evoking extensive neural synchrony because they can strain people's attention, their reactions, their inferences, and so on so effectively. And generally, no matter what the details of your study are, it's safe to assume that you probably want to keep people's attention so that they won't just start thinking of something totally unrelated to your task or the context you're providing for them, and you probably don't want people to take a nap during your study. So this is a good thing. But if you're interested in dividing people up in terms of some individual difference variable or predicting variability in some kind of processing, you of course need to evoke variability in that kind of processing. So you don't want to constrain and entrain people too much, right? So the best stimuli to use are really going to depend on your research goals. And it's really important to consider this carefully to make sure that your study will be sensitive to your effects of interest. So the right stimulus for you, it might be an educational TV program like Jessica Cantlon's group has used really effectively if you're interested in predicting mathematical or verbal understanding in children. Or it might be a story that's meant to evoke suspicion in some people, but not so much in others if you're interested in predicting paranoia, like you saw in Emily Finn's work that I touched on at the start of this talk, and that's detailed in her tutorial for this course. And sometimes the right choice for stimuli to use in your study might not be so clear-cut, maybe like trying to figure out what's going to predict who's going to become friends with one another or something like that, but you can at least make educated guesses in how to create and how to curate your stimuli based on things like behavioral research and experience at the very least. So you really want to be thoughtful about the stimuli that you select. And then once you've selected your stimuli, if you're not using one long movie or story, you'll need to figure out how you're going to show them to participants. So things like what order you're going to put them in. You're going to have one predetermined order for everyone, or you're going to counterbalance or randomize things across participants? Well, if you're interested primarily in individual differences like personality traits or things like social outcomes, so subject level variables, then it can be useful to show everyone in your study exactly the same stimuli in exactly the same order. This creates a common context for everyone and avoids introducing noise related to things other than intrinsic individual differences. So you could introduce variability due to things like what someone was thinking about or feeling in response to what they had just seen or heard. So like if one participant had just been amused and another had just been outraged or bored or saddened before watching a given clip that you're comparing people's responses on. On the other hand, if you're primarily interested in comparing different stimuli or different characteristics of your stimuli, it makes sense to counterbalance or at least randomize your stimulus order to mitigate order effects and heighten your ability to interpret what's driving differences in neural responses on a stimulus level. But it's a trade-off because this could dampen your sensitivity to individual differences that you might be interested in because the context surrounding each stimulus, so each scene or each clip or each part of the story is going to differ from person to person. And it's important to keep in mind that the same qualities that make naturalistic stimuli so engaging and so richly resemble real life can also make it difficult to confidently interpret what's really causing differences in the neural responses evoked by different stimuli. Because there's so much that varies across things like scenes in a movie or parts of a story or clips from different TV shows or movies other than the variable that you might want to focus on and that you might want to base your interpretations on. And this is because naturalistic stimuli are inherently so uncontrolled. So different clips or different scenes can vary in all sorts of ways, like audiovisual properties, things related to how they were filmed, so camera angles, coloring, prosody, and music, things about the actor's appearance and performance that might be separate from the narrative features yourself that you want to focus on, or even differences in when things happened in your study, right? So, for example, what something was preceded by and the emotions and memories that had just been evoked. And even if a scene occurred at the beginning of the study when people were more awake, or closer to the end of the study when they might be sleepy after laying in the scanner for an hour under a blanket with that rhythmic scanning noise maybe lulling them to sleep. So it can be pragmatic to avoid some of these potential issues by either designing your study to focus on individual differences or to at least look at how stimulus-related characteristics interact with individual differences, since all your participants will presumably see the same stimuli, making stimulus-related compounds less of an issue. The important thing is really to know what you're most interested in and decide on that going in, and then design your study to optimize your ability to detect the kinds of differences that you're most interested in, both in the choices you make in selecting your stimuli and in how you arrange them. After you've designed and run your study, there are some important considerations for data analysis for naturalistic neuroimaging studies, some of which are covered in detail in the tutorial notebooks for this course, and I'll go over a few of them here. So one basic consideration is whether you want to look at time series of neural responses by voxel or by region. So the example study that I went over with you took a region-based approach, which can be helpful in some ways. For example, you can average out some high spatial frequency noise because we're averaging neural responses at each TR across voxels. You can also get better correspondence between people at a region to region level versus at a voxel to voxel level, since we know that fine scale correspondences aren't as good going across people as coarser scale correspondences like between brain regions. Another potential benefit of a region-based approach is that this could be a principled way to cut down on the number of comparisons you have to run or the number of features you'll have if you want to do some sort of predictive modeling like I briefly went over. But it's difficult to know things like, what granularity of parcellation is most appropriate for a given analysis. So for example, if there are significant effects driven by really small regions within some of these parcels, this method where you're averaging across voxels within a parcel at each TR might lead to missing out on those kinds of effects. So comparing data from corresponding voxels between participants can work really well too. and using functional alignment approaches can get around the issues related to anatomical correspondences between people not being hugely precise, and those methods are also detailed in the tutorial notebooks for this course. Another important consideration is if you want to look at inter-subject similarity in how response magnitudes change over time, or in how response patterns change over time. So for example, you can also extract neural patterns at each TR from each region instead of just the spatially averaged response, and then make a time point by time point correlation matrix to capture how neural response patterns fluctuate over time, like what you see here. And beside that is just a schematic visualization where the color corresponds to TR order, and dots that are closer together are patterns that are more similar to one another. And so you can compare people in terms of these trajectories of multivoxel patterns, or essentially just how neural response patterns in a given region fluctuate over time during exposure to a naturalistic stimulus by just comparing the off-diagonal halves of these time point by time point similarity matrices. And this is great because we know from so much research on MBPA that there's a lot of information that we'll simply miss out on if we only look at overall response magnitude at each time point. And sure enough, if we compare the results of inter-subject correlation analyses, looking at how response magnitudes averaged within a region fluctuate over time, and how distributed response patterns within regions fluctuate over time, we see pretty different results. So that's what you see here from that same data set, that social network data set that I just went over with you. So on the bottom here are average inter-subject correlations using that more traditional method of correlating response magnitude time series between each pair of people. And on the top in green are the average inter-subject similarities for each region when computing inter-subject similarities based on response pattern trajectories over time. And you can see that the areas where inter-subject similarity was highest in terms of region average response magnitudes are not the same as the regions where inter-subject similarity was highest in terms of fluctuations in multivoxel response patterns. So for example, on the top in green, you can see that areas implicated in things like representing abstract concepts and also social cognition, for example, among other functions, like the anterior ventral temporal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, are more similar across subjects relative to other brain regions when comparing people in terms of how multivoxel response patterns change over time. But when characterizing people in terms of how region average response magnitudes change over time, inter-subject similarity was highest in areas involved in things like auditory and visual perception. So this suggests that comparing perceivers and how multivoxel response patterns change over time, rather just than in terms of how response magnitudes fluctuate over time, can be a particularly promising way to capture inter-subject similarities in regions involved in high-level processing. And in these areas, multivoxel response pattern trajectories might capture similarities in how states change over time that are not captured when only considering fluctuations in overall spatially averaged response magnitudes. And these different ways of characterizing time series similarity are also differentially related to social outcomes, in this case, social distance. So what I went over with you when discussing that study. So here, inter-subject similarity in multivoxel response pattern trajectories tended to be positively associated with social network proximity in the medial prefrontal cortex and in the vicinity of the temporal poles. But this was not the case when looking at response magnitude fluctuations. So characterizing how multivoxel response patterns evolve over time during naturalistic stimulation could be a particularly promising way to characterize individual differences in high-level processing and predicting social outcomes in future research. And there's also the question of what distance measure to use, both for comparing participants to each other in terms of their behavioral data and in terms of their neural data. So for the neural data, it's most common to use Pearson correlation distances between time series. But as you'll see in Yara's talk, if you haven't watched it already, using Euclidean distances can work well and can sometimes even work better than Pearson correlation distances for comparing neural responses to naturalistic stimuli, since the Euclidean distance is sensitive to both the overall response magnitude and how that response changes over time, whereas Pearson correlations would just be sensitive to how responses are changing over time. And there are other really important data analytic considerations to keep in mind as well. Things like how significance testing will be done, particularly if you're analyzing data where you're looking at differences between all possible dyads. So where each subject participates in multiple possible dyads. So they contribute multiple data points. And it's important to think carefully about how significance testing will be done in these cases, because this will introduce dependencies in the data set that stem from each person participating in multiple dyads. And one simple way to address this is with permutation testing approaches where each individual keeps their own behavioral data, but their brain responses are randomly shuffled, or vice versa, keep everyone's behavioral data the same, but shuffle everyone's brain data, and then go on to calculate differences between people in your behavioral outcome of interest and in your neural data. And it's important to do this shuffling before calculating distances between people to ensure that the permuted data sets will have the same dependency structure as the actual data set. So these are just a few experimental design and data analytic issues that are important to consider if you're interested in using naturalistic neuroimaging data to predict social outcomes, or more generally, individual differences or dyadic differences between people. So to sum up, hopefully what I've shown you today is that while naturalistic stimuli that capture the richness of everyday experience are extremely effective at entraining people's brains to one another, the extent to which this happens depends on situational factors like our goals and context, and on individual differences. And this makes naturalistic neuroimaging a really powerful tool for examining social questions and individual differences more broadly. And by carefully considering some of the design and data analytic factors that I've gone over here, I hope that you'll have a sense of how to use this kind of approach effectively in your own research. And so I'd just like to finish by thanking the people who are involved in the empirical work that I told you about, as well as members of my lab in general and our funding sources for doing this kind of work. And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to email me and get in touch.